With the select few horror movies that we've talked about here on the channel, I would say that they are maybe not necessarily worthy of a remake, but definitely due to have one, so that if enough people decided it was worth their time, both from a studio point of view and from a fan point of view, I think a remake could actually work. And surprisingly, to me at least, I would say this is one of those occasions, because Wishmaster is a movie which I've owned for a few months, but I just never got around to watching it. I'd heard very bad things about it, but I thought, you know what, it's an interesting concept, an evil genie, so sure, let's check it out. I expected it to be cheap and cheesy with no redeeming qualities whatsoever, and to be fair, I did not even expect to finish the movie. However, I did. And although it's definitely not among my favourites, I would say there is a lot in this movie to love. Now, to get the stuff which is easily its weakest points out of the way first, and then of course we'll get to the story and what it's actually about, because you can find out that kind of information pretty easily, and chances are you probably already have. Well, as far as the stuff that I didn't like, predominantly it's definitely the acting. There are some truly awful performances in this movie, especially when it comes to line delivery, and that, of course, is one of the most prime reasons that a remake would do it far more justice, because the standard that we hold these movies to these days, generally speaking, is much higher. Even if you compare the really bad modern horror films to the best of back in the day, they're not that dissimilar, more often than not, especially when it comes to supporting characters. Now, this movie, speaking of the characters and of the actors in there as well, it's got some real big names in the horror world. Tony Todd makes an appearance, Wes Craven produced the movie, you've got Kane Hodder in there in a small role as a security guard, and Robert Englund in a fairly central role in the movie. In fact, he's not in the movie a huge amount, but he's in it here and there, and he has certainly an instrumental part, you could definitely say, in the plot. It's kind of all down to him as far as the modern day part of the movie goes. Now, speaking about the time difference that I just alluded to, the story itself of Wishmaster is a fairly simple one, and if I was going to epitomise what this movie is like, I would say it's very much so like a combination of The Relic and Nightmare on Elm Street. Imagine if you put those two movies together. Now, in terms of story, it's remarkably similar to The Relic. It's set in a very museum-esque setting with a lot of scientific jargon and a lot of archaeological jargon, and it revolves around this kind of cursed object, if you will, in a similar way to the Cthulhu mythology in The Relic. The difference is, although a lot of people don't love The Relic, although I personally think there's a lot to love there as well, I would definitely say that The Relic pulls off having a more serious tone far better than Wishmaster does. Wishmaster goes real heavy on the cheddar cheese, whereas in The Relic, it at least tries. You've got some more serious actors in there, they're not giving as cheesy a performance. Now, as far as the story goes, I said it's very similar. Now, where the Friday the 13th, or actually not Friday the 13th, where the Nightmare on Elm Street, I should say, connection comes in, is not just Robert Englund being in there, but also the way the main antagonist acts, this Wishmaster, the Djinn, or the Genie. He acts in a very Freddy Krueger kind of way, taking on different faces and manipulating reality and kind of making nightmarish scenarios come to life with these crazy practical effects. There's a lot of body horror type stuff, again, very Nightmare on Elm Street-esque, and I actually loved all of that stuff. Now, another thing that I didn't like, to go kind of up and down with the likes and dislikes, was the voice. The voice of the Wishmaster does not match the appearance, because the appearance of him, it works, it looks good. The makeup doubtless took many hours to do, and although he's not scary, he certainly looks like a distinct character, almost like a cross between Freddy Krueger and the Creeper from Jeepers Creepers to some degree. And as a character, he's an interesting one. He is bound by the rule of 3 wishes, as we know genies for, but he has ulterior motives. And also, he's kind of like what Spock would be if Spock were evil and a genie, where he takes your wishes very literally and turns them against you. And that, of course, allows for a lot of creativity in the movie, and that was awesome to see. I genuinely loved to see how creative they got, because they actually did a lot of wacky stuff in the film, but carried out in a really visually intriguing way. When these wishes are being carried out, generally to the detriment of someone's life more often than not, they're riveting to look at. They're weird, they're very intricately planned out, they're effective, they're memorable, and I actually liked the majority of them. Now, a couple of them are kind of let down by some very dated CGI effects, which is unfortunate, but all of the practical effects and all of the makeup effects really hold up well. They look fantastic, and some of it was actually very reminiscent of the last 10 minutes of Society, another cult classic kind of horror thriller sort of movie, and if you've seen that, you'll know what I'm talking about. So again, all of these references that I'm making are to movies which have a fair amount of fans, so it's very clear that my opinion of Wishmaster is not the same as many people. Many people just write off the movie as being trash, and I can definitely see why. For me though, this movie has easily enough in there to redeem it and to make it worth watching at least once, and so I would definitely recommend doing so. Now, as far as getting back to the story itself, it's pretty much exactly what I said, where it's this genie who can grant you 3 wishes, but in the world of this mythology, a genie is much more than just a wish-giving little impish creature. It's a race, a species of evil creatures who are incredibly powerful, but are also very bound strictly to this 3-wish rule. And basically what he wants to do is he wants to wish, or he wants to get the people who have rubbed the lamp, in effect, to use all 3 wishes, because in so doing that allows him to release the rest of his kind into the world. And this is set up very early on in the film, again with some great special effects and practical effects and makeup right at the start of the movie, which is set way back in the day, I believe in Persian times if I recall correctly. But yeah, I think there's plenty in there to work with as far as a remake goes. Now, as far as whether or not it will be remade, well, probably not anytime soon. I believe there were sequels as well, if I recall correctly, although I can't say I've seen any of those. And considering the quality of the first one, I don't really have particularly high expectations for the rest, at least as far as the acting goes. But yeah, I would say this is one of those movies that's definitely worth a look, if nothing else. Now, as far as my scores, for the story and the plot, I'm going to give it a 5. And the reason why I'm going to give it a 5, which is fairly generous, that's a neutral on my scale, it's not overly bad or overly good, is because of just that. It's not the story which is bad, it's the characters which are bad, the line delivery, the way they deliver what they're given to work with, which is sometimes horrendous. That's not the story's fault. The story is actually good enough to present an interesting horror movie. Just because it's simple doesn't mean it's bad. Look at what Eli Roth and company did with Clown. Very similar to It, but different enough to be worth a different movie, and I would say a very good one. So for the story, I'm giving it a neutral. It could have been done better, but it could have been done a lot worse. As far as the characters, well, for that I'm giving it a 3. They're not great. In fact, as I said, sometimes they're just straight up bad, so 3 is fairly generous sometimes in this movie, and even the Wishmaster himself, as I said, his voice doesn't even match his face. He has this kind of weird accent, which kind of makes sense, but then the tone of his voice doesn't really sound that intimidating. You expect him to have this kind of, I don't know, demonic sort of voice, but the way he sounds is more like, "You will have 3 wishes." And it just doesn't work. It sounds kind of dumb, and you probably think, well, what he just did sounded dumb. Well, yeah, it did, because that's what he sounds like in the film. Trust me, it sounds really dumb. So you could easily do the voice a lot better. So again, you could do like the difference between Skarsgård and Tim Curry's Pennywise. The voices are totally different, but they both work in different ways. So again, you could easily remake something like that and make some adjustments. As far as the visuals, the special effects, well, for that, I'm actually going to give it an 8. Which is pretty generous, I know, and the reason why it's not going up to, say, a 9, even though the makeup effects, the practical effects are fantastic, is twofold. One, it's not just about special effects. This score is based on the visual style of the movie as well, and sometimes that definitely lets it down. There are some really weird close-ups of people's faces that linger for way too long, and also, as I said, some of the digital effects let it down in terms of aging. So yeah, those 2 things in particular knock it down from maybe a 9 out of 10 for me. It was never going to be a full 10 though, let's be honest, but still, an 8 is a very respectable score. Now, as far as the audio, the soundtrack, again, I'm going to give it a 5. and the reasons are fairly obvious. The music doesn't necessarily age super well, the sound design in general is fairly basic, nothing too mind-blowing, and as I said, the main character needs an iconic voice, and although it is iconic, it's kind of iconic in the wrong ways. He sounds a bit dumb. So yeah, I would say that 5 is actually fairly generous. And finally, for the rewatchability, I'm going to give it a 6, and the reason why I'm bumping it up from a neutral 5 to a 6 is because I think it does have some merit. It is worth watching at least once. If you are a horror aficionado, if you like these iconic centerpiece monsters like Freddy and Jason and those kind of thing, but if you enjoy the less obvious ones like the Cathoga or like the Creeper or like this one, Wishmaster, then yeah, check it out. You might find yourself liking the mythology of the creature, the way he looks, the way he acts in the film, and you can definitely use your imagination to kind of think up new ways that he could be used in modern times. Especially with the way society is now with just viewing it as a joke, that kind of plays into the genie mythology even more than it did in this movie. So yeah, I think there's definitely room for improvement there. You could make I think a really good modern version of this if somebody actually put their hand to it. And so overall, my combined score of all 5 categories put together for the original Wishmaster movie is actually a fairly generous 2.7. out of 5, which is of course above my flat baseline score of 2.5. So a lot of people would easily rate it as under par. But overall, a 2.7, which is of course a 5.4 out of 10, is a lot higher than many people would give this movie. So definitely worth a look. If you're talking just about the visuals of the film, there is a lot to love. In fact, I would say it's one of the best undervalued horror movies in terms of having a lot of special effects and a lot of creative kills. And it's a very easily overlooked one. It's kind of like Final Destination, where it is loved, but it's not always in the conversation. And it does deserve to be. This movie deserves to be in the conversation more when it comes to practical effects and makeup effects, because it's very good and very imaginative. So overall, definitely worth a look. Don't expect to love everything about it. Some things will definitely annoy you, but I think there's plenty to love. But that's it for this review overall. Of course, I will see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.